We have to create a crisis. The common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, and famine would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. Problem definition. In the 1970s, we were going to freeze to death. In the 1980s, we were going to burn up because of ozone depletion. In the 1990s, global warming, that became the new climate change mantra into the 2000s. In 1987, the cause of the problem, according to the UN, poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems because nations like the U.S. consume too much and have too much wealth, much in the form of private property.
In my inaugural address, I pledged that America would respond to the growing threat of climate change for the sake of our children and future generations.
In order to create a solution for climate change, the United Nations came up with this definition of sustainable development, which is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Needs are dictated, wants are not allowed. This is Marxist ideology, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. The green goal really has nothing to do with climate change at all. It is all about system change from capitalism to socialism. This is our definition of sustainable development. Sustainability is artificial scarcity under the guise of conservation. It is a behavior modification scheme through social engineering. At its core, it is worldwide rationing. It is less of everything. Less food, less water, less energy, less mobility, less choice, less freedom. Sustainability is rationing. It is ultimately about control.
I think the real reason is it's control. It's really about hierarchy, control. We know better. We want to have a society which works this way. And America, by nature, works this way.
In a great nation like ours, you can't let people do what they want. It has to be coordinated.
Los Angeles seems like this big sprawling mess, almost designed to give planners and ambitious politicians splitting headaches. But should it? LA is spread out, and yes, there are a lot of cars, which is why politicians and planners want LA to be more like New York, with its high-density living, towering skyscrapers, and state-of-the-art subway system. And they want to do it by pushing Californians away from cars and single-family houses.
Building single-family homes in large lots is not going to be very popular. Single-family homes in small lots and multifamily will be more popular and more affordable.
Hassan Ikrada runs the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG. SCAG coordinates planning for all of Southern California. It subsidizes government projects and hands out lucrative contracts to big developers who help implement its vision of a denser Southern California.
We're going to add 4 million people to this region in the next 25 years. The demographic shifts, the rising cost of commuting, the rising cost of gasoline, energy, is going to kind of probably have people think again about their choices where to live.
I think the real reason is it's control. It's really about hierarchy, control. We know better. We want to have a society which works this way. And America, by nature, works this way.
Joel Kotkin, Chapman University professor and author of The Next 100 Million, points out that for more than a decade, more people are moving out of California than are moving in. So why the push for more density? Kotkin points to an ideology called smart growth.
Smart growth, I think, was very much based on this idea that you had to control what was going on with a very centralized plan. Also, this really is a way of favoring well-entrenched developers against either entrepreneurial developers and in many ways favoring urban developers over those who are in the suburbs. So there's a confluence of kind of an ideology or religion of smart growth with a powerful economic force of rent-seeking capitalists who support it.
We're a proponent for us planning for the future. We're a proponent for us coordinating infrastructure with how we're going to grow. If that's what you call smart growth, so be it.
I think that one of the biggest problems that the planners have is they are just contemptuous of what human beings want, what the vast majority of the population wants. And I don't think that works long term. This isn't Europe. The next generation will look for other places to live what they consider to be American middle-class standard of living. We have a growing population. We just did a survey recently, millennials, their favorite place where they want to live is suburbs. Now, you can impose this kind of planning regime over people's preferences. I think you'll get enormous pushback over time. The planners have this idea, this is how a city should look. Everything should be ascending to the high point of Manhattan, which, by the way, has the most distorted distribution of income of any place in the United States. The problem with regional planning organizations is they tend to be top-down and dominated by the local elites. The neighborhoods have to fight this almost a kind of guerrilla style, like the Viet Cong. You know, they have to fight in their neighborhoods. They're trying to do something here, and then everybody gets upset. The big developer, they have professional meeting goers who go to meetings. Unions have their hacks to do things. The Greens have all sorts of money, and they can send people to these meetings. We have to make a living. We have to support our family. We have to take our kids to school. We don't have time to do that. If you really believe suburbs are going to die, then let them die and let the market address the situation. Let people's preferences express themselves a little bit. We don't know where we're going necessarily.
And the irony of this push for high-density planning is that even though LA is less dense than, say, Manhattan, if you zoom out a bit, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim is the densest urban area in the country. What say you, New York, Newark?
The key thing that makes LA different, and most American cities different from New York, is something called history. New York was developed primarily before the automobile. LA is an entrepreneurial city dominated by small businesses. The vast majority of its growth has taken place under the automobile. And so that's its DNA. Now, you can think about how you improve that and make it work, but you can't fundamentally change it.
Maybe all this so-called sprawl isn't so bad after all. It's what makes LA LA, which is more like a bunch of smaller cities crammed together inside of a bigger city. From the walkable beach towns of Santa Monica and Venice on the west side, to the tourist-friendly district of Hollywood, to the historic single-family homes of Leimert Park. Do we really need a handful of planners designing growth patterns when we could have thousands of individual choices shaping a city? For Reason TV, I'm Zach Weissmuller.
How sustainable development is fomented. SD is fomented through behavior modification, zoning and land use controls, smart meters on all utilities, reduced vehicle use, tax by mile and toll roads, increased taxes on bonds, property taxes, increased code enforcement. And for example, in Davos, Switzerland in January 2015, Al Gore said that we need $90 trillion to redesign cities with no cars. SD is fomented through stakeholder groups and outcome-based local consensus meetings. This is crony capitalism. In public-private partnerships, we have crony capitalism, corporatism, and corporate welfare, where government is in bed with big business, profits are privatized, and losses are socialized. It legitimizes corruption. Ultimately, this is known as fascism. This is fomented through bipartisanship consensus known as the dialectic. The ultimate goal is what Pat Wood mentions in his book, Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. The ultimate goal of technocracy is a scientific dictatorship and will be accomplished by changing the economic structure of the world from capitalism's free market price-based economy to a scientific dictatorship based on strict carbon-based rationing systems. In this new economy, people will be issued carbon credits where cash will be obsolete. Unlike cash, carbon credits will expire. People will not be able to save and individually prosper. In this new Orwellian economy, people will once again return to serf status of the Dark Ages.
CAP is basically another word for limit. The government is going to place a cap on the amount of carbon dioxide electric utilities are allowed to release into the atmosphere. They will also decide how many carbon allowances or permits will be allowed each year. Allowances will most likely be bought and sold under an auction scenario. As cleaner electricity production alternatives are developed and commercially available, some utilities may not need all their allowances. Those utilities can trade or sell their additional permits to other utilities that need more allowances. All the while, the government will reduce the number of allowances available each year, further driving utilities to adapt new or cleaner fuel sources while driving the value and cost of remaining allowances even higher. Now, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of buying, selling, and trading of carbon allowances going on in this cap and trade story. So you may be asking yourself, who's going to pay for all this? Well, you are. Under the proposed cap and trade policy, power companies in coal-dependent states like Indiana will have to buy a lot of carbon allowances. This means the cost of production will go up. And when the cost of production goes up, the price goes up. That's the price you will pay each month when you get your electric bill.
Under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket.
An industry that was very reliable for 100 years was all of a sudden turned into a casino.
The UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Timeline. In June 18, 2015, the Pope released his encyclical supporting climate change. The United Nations Sustainable Development Summit in 2015 from September 25th through September 27th in New York City presented a 15-year action plan entitled Transforming Our World, the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. From November 30th to December 18, 2015, there was a conference of the parties in Paris, France, where foreign NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, demanded reparations from Western nations. Interesting also to note is that our Congress gave $500 million via the Omnibus package in November 2015 to the brand new Climate Action Fund. On Earth Day 2016, John Kerry signed the historic Paris Climate Accord to reduce CO2 to 25% below 2000 levels by 2025. Treaty language was left out to skirt Congress. UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon stated, "We are in a race against time. The era of consumption without consequences is over." The American Coalition for Sustainable Communities has published a report titled The UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a Critique. It outlines the 17 Sustainable Development Goals outlined at the Paris Agreement. Goal 1, end poverty through wealth redistribution schemes. Goal 2, end hunger through control of all food and production. Ensure healthy living by reducing vehicle use, ride, bike, and walk. Ensure inclusive and equitable education, control of free education, Common Core, and debt financing. Achieve gender equality, empower all women and young girls. 6. Sustainable management and control of all water. Sustainable energy. Control of all energy, allow only subsidized renewables like wind and solar, and kill off fossil fuels. Promote sustained economic growth through control of the economy or social engineering. Promote sustainable industrialization through socialization of the economy, which is replacing the free market with a carbon-based credit economy or technocracy as previously mentioned. Reduce inequality within and among countries. This is straight-up wealth redistribution. Oneness makes cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, and resilient, and sustainable. This is nothing but socialism. Ensure sustainable consumption patterns through behavior modification. Take urgent action to control climate change through regulation and taxes or wealth redistribution. Conserve and sustainably use oceans, control of oceans, and stop oil exploration. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies through social engineering. Sustain use of ecosystems, control of all land and forests. Revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development through colony capitalism or wealth redistribution. How sustainable development is implemented. UN Agenda Scope and Finance. There are two primary vehicles for getting UN Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 into the U.S. economy. Under Agenda 21, it's local in scope and it's financed by federal grants. Agenda 2030 is international in scope and financed by Western nations. Agenda 21 is a program of action to inventory, catalog, and inventory every single asset in the world. It has two primary components, smart growth and the Wildlands Project. Under smart growth, in California there are two global warming bills, AB 32 and S 375. The Wildlands Project is primarily dealing with rural open space. California AB 32, or the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, basically regulates air. Claims are made that it puts California at the forefront of national and international efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. AB 32 is implemented through CARB, which stands for the California Air Resources Board. Their goal is to reduce CO2 reduction and reduce vehicle use. They also have a cap and trade program, which is to mandate renewable energy use in the state. California AB 32 under 38564, the state board shall consult with other states and federal government and other nations to identify the most effective strategies and methods to reduce greenhouse gases. Under 38565, the state board shall ensure direct public and private investment toward the most disadvantaged communities. The American Coalition for Sustainable Communities has published a report titled UN Agenda 21, Sustainable Development in California. In that report, it states that AB 32 will cost consumers $136 billion by 2020. Annual direct costs, $35 billion. 26% emission reductions will come from economic slowdown. California will have 262,000 fewer jobs by 2020, an increase in energy costs of $2,500 per family. And the kicker is it will reduce state and local tax revenue by $7.5 billion annually. California SB 375, or the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act of 2008, requires metropolitan regions to plan land use, transportation, and housing investments to accommodate future growth in a manner consistent with addressing global warming. Note that when they mention investments, that's new taxes. SB 375 is implemented through smart growth and infill development. Under smart growth, we have walkable, bikeable, and mass transit communities. And in infill development, we have high-density housing popping up in suburban areas. California SB 375 under 65588D2, the number of housing units for persons and families of low to moderate income are required to be provided in new housing developments either within the coastal zone or within 3 miles of the coastal zone. California SB 375 replicates elements of Johnson's Great Society. It's like rebuilding the projects of the 1960s all over again and then tearing them down. Smart growth implementation in your city typically is done under a general plan for sustainable community strategy update. Its components include walkable, bikeable communities and mass transit. It also might include a climate action plan with the goal of CO2 reduction, renewable energy like wind and solar, and a vehicle mileage tax. It also includes a housing element, and note that the housing element is really the only element of a general plan update that's required by law. The typical reason that a city does a sustainable community strategy update is for grant money, even though the whole plan is voluntary. Ideal communist city versus smart growth: high-density housing, mixed-use developments, mixed-income housing, transit-oriented development, discourages auto parking, calls suburbs monotonous, minimizes private yards, maximizes common areas, minimizes private interiors, and the only difference between that and a communist city is the height of the residential buildings. So we have unintended consequences. The state nudges cities to rezone for high density under sustainable community strategy. Low interest rates creates a moral hazard because builders malinvest in projects that they would have normally not invested in. Cheap rates cause an overinvestment in high-density housing. A bubble is formed. In his book, Spreading the Wealth, Stanley Kurtz denotes that the primary motive for all this is to loot the conservative voting bloc in rural communities and suburbs through demographic transformation. Regionalism is basically replacing our elected form of government with unelected boards, bodies, and commission. Ultimately, this dilutes local control. If you'll note, in the Southern California region, it dips down into the city of Tijuana, Mexico. The ultimate goal is globalization and erasing national borders. SCAG's Sustainable Community Strategy allocates only 13% of gas tax money for new roads and repairs. It focuses 50% growth within a 3% land area, constraining growth. And it switches from a 7.3 ratio of single-family homes to multifamily homes to a 3 to 7 ratio in favor of high-density housing. One form of high density is what is known as transit-oriented development. This requires a mass transit element for trains and buses, walkable bicycle lanes for vehicle traffic calming. It's interesting to note that developers typically get an environmental waiver for this type of development, which negates the reason for global warming CO2 reduction in the first place. It promotes a vehicle mileage tax, which is nothing more than behavior modification. Transit-oriented development also is known as complete streets development. It's really a planner's utopia. People are like water. They find the path of least resistance in the end. Scientists can't even predict the weather, but they can somehow predict climate change? Creating a crisis, creating a solution. The road to socialism basically comes through redistribution of wealth, import poverty, overwhelm the infrastructure, creating real resource scarcities, create faux artificial scarcities and shortages by constraining resource capacity, for example, the water crisis. Goal: destroy the middle class.
In the winter of 2012, from about November to February, we were at what's called 200% above normal rainfall. California's funny the way we measure hydrology. So we say 100% is normal, and if you're at 200% above that, that means you're double normal. And we had this extreme, what we call a above normal scenario for about 62 days, from November to February. And during that time period, the agencies came in under agency discretion and said, we're going to stop all water from moving from north to south during this extreme flow period. And during that 62-day period, the state of California, the people of California, the farms of California, the businesses of California, the moms and dads of 2.5 children of California lost 857,000 acre-feet of water. And what does that translate in real terms? That's the entire annual water supply for the Los Angeles basin. That left our reservoirs throughout the state at low levels because they weren't allowed to recharge during that high rain and snow period, and they were continually being sucked down during 2013 just to meet basic demand throughout the state. So when we went into 2014, we actually went into it in a deficit because our reservoirs were already at record lows going into a period of little to no rainfall, and now no recharge. So this is a drought on top of a drought. Our reservoirs in 2014 are at the lowest levels they've been in many cases since construction. And even when we did receive some rain and snow here in the early parts of 2014, agencies and operations, both at the state and federal level, were allowing water to move through the delta out to sea at a rate of 150,000 cubic feet per second to 250,000 cubic feet per second. 100,000 people's homes' annual water supply a week. And it was
the Proposition 1 water bond, which was passed in November 2014, didn't really solve anything at all. It's financing our own destruction. $290 million went for unelected conservancy groups that have nothing to do with increasing water supplies. $10 million went for protecting sand dunes between Palm Springs and the Salton Sea. $17 million went for bike and walking trails. Includes money for dam removal on the Klamath River, which is antithetical to the mission statement of increasing water storage. Money for water storage will only increase water storage by 1% from current levels. Optimized demand management is basically setting artificial scarcities under the goal of conservation. It's nothing more than rationing. The solutions are typically tiered water rates, budget-based rates, and rebates. This discourages market-based solutions and is basically centralized planning from the government on our water supplies. Here's some of the activism that has taken place in California. In the city of Aliso Viejo, a Green City Initiative or a Climate Action Plan was tabled. In Chino Hills, an open space land banking plan was tabled. In Hollywood, in a judicial decision, population forecasts used for the housing element in a general plan update were found to be fatally flawed. The plan was defeated. In San Juan Capistrano, tiered water rates were found to be unconstitutional. And one Bay Area plan, which implements priority development areas, is currently in litigation. In Huntington Beach, restricted high-density development is pending litigation. The city does not want it. And in Rancho Cucamonga, Melrose tax was defeated. And in Fontana, a climate action plan is being tabled and being reconsidered. Potential solutions, symptoms versus cause. Support the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2015, or H.R. 24. We must stop Congress's perpetual piggy bank. Get the U.S. out of the United Nations. Support the American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2015, known as H.R. 1205. So to sum up, sustainable development is artificial scarcity under the guise of conservation. It is a behavior modification scheme through social engineering. It is rationing. It is fomented through artificial crisis. Sustainable development is implemented locally through UN Agenda 21 and smart growth. The UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is designed to change the economic structure of the world and redistribute wealth from rich nations to poor nations. The ultimate goal of sustainable development is to redistribute wealth away from the middle class, lowering standards of living. Therefore, sustainable development is unsustainable because at some point, the parasite kills the host.